After 1 year, Apple has finally managed to launch a new iPad Pro generation and wrestled back the title of the most powerful tablet on the market from its longtime rival, also Apple. If you didn't know, Apple already had the most powerful tablet computer out there in the form of the 2020 iPad Pro, and they are the dominant player in the tablet market. For 2020, they had a market share greater than 33%, for instance, for worldwide shipments for the entire year. However, this latest move goes to show that they're not taking their foot off the accelerator anytime soon, and they want to be in control of the tablet market for many years to come. However, before we take a more detailed look at the 2021 iPad Pro that they've just introduced last week, for those of you that are new here, my name is Andrei, I'm a tech enthusiast and I do tech videos for a hobby. If you find any of my content interesting or informative, please subscribe to the channel, enable notifications, that way you'll get notified every time I put out new content, and you will also be helping me in growing out the channel, which would mean the world to me. With that being said, let's cue the intro and let's take a closer look at the iPad Pro 2021. Like I've already said, last year's iPad Pro 2020 model was already the most powerful tablet in the market. However, that particular generation wasn't a huge marked improvement and was more, let's say, a facelift of the 2018 model. However, that's no longer the case with this generation, as it gets very significant upgrades over its predecessor. First, you get the M1 SoC inside, the same chip that powers pretty much all of Apple's latest products, MacBooks and iMacs included. Well, they've now found a way to include it in the iPad Pro. In addition to that, in the new models, you also get greatly increased RAM capacity, faster storage, 5G connectivity for the first time in an iPad, new ultra-wide front-facing camera, and also a fantastic new display labeled Liquid Retina XDR. First, the M1. Well, Apple showed pretty much the entire process in its presentation. They yanked out the internals from one of their M1 powered MacBooks, mated it with the existing design of the iPad Pro, and presto, you have a new model. And to make sure that they don't void the warranty on either of the devices involved in the swap, they got the only person in the world who can open up Apple products without voiding their warranty to do the operation: Tim Cook himself. To top it all off, they took the Pro Display XDR, shrunk it down to size while improving it, gave it touch support and added it on the front of the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and gave it a cool new name, Liquid Retina XDR. Sadly, the 11-inch model has to make do with last year's display as it's missing out on this new technology. This long-rumored mini LED display comes with some very impressive specs: a typical max brightness of 1000 nits, which can reach up all the way to 1600 nits in HDR content, a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, and it uses more than 10,000 LEDs arrayed in 2,500 local dimming zones. For comparison, the Pro Display XDR, that only has to make do with 576. So the contrast levels that we're going to see on this iPad Pro are going to be fantastic. The display is significantly brighter than any Mac or iOS device on the market currently, and it's clearly being designed with video and photography professionals in mind. Apart from that, the front-facing camera itself is also very interesting. Now it's an ultra-wide design with a 122-degree field of vision, and it's being specifically built with the iPad in mind, like Apple shared in their presentation. Apart from that, in conjunction with the True Depth sensor in the iPad Pro, it brings a new cool feature labeled Center Stage. As demonstrated during the presentation, the purpose is that during FaceTime calls, it will make you, the subject of the call, be at the center of the image, even if you're moving about the room, but still in the field of view of the camera. This technology looks awesome in usage, and it's a pretty awesome addition to the product overall. And if I read correctly, it's also going to work with third-party apps outside of FaceTime, so it's probably going to work very well with Zoom calls, for instance. Now, before we get any further in the video, I want to say from the get-go that I think this generation of iPad Pro is absolutely fantastic. They're absolutely great devices, but I do have some issues with them, and we'll get into that just in a bit. Another thing that I want to mention is that for the purpose of my comments from now on, I'm not going to really lean too much on the 11-inch iPad Pro, as it's losing out on Liquid Retina XDR, which is a major feature of this release. It's not really a true Pro device anymore. It's more akin to a beefed up iPad Air, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that buying the 11-inch doesn't make any sense, but I'm just saying that it doesn't make any sense from my point of view. If your point of view differs, that's totally fine and awesome, because guess what? We're all different and we all think differently. If it fits your scenario better, good for you. Let's all be happy that at least the 11-inch model gets to keep the same base price as last year. And with that, let's jump into the first issue I have with the iPad Pro, namely pricing. The price for the 12.9-inch model has increased by 10% year over year, so it now starts at $1,199 as opposed to last year's $999. But that's just the start of the story. The 5G connectivity that they've harped so much about? Well, that's another $200. So in reality, the base model with 5G starts at $1,300, and it gets more expensive from there. Adding extra storage is rather expensive in typical Apple fashion, but it gets even a little bit worse than that. You see, the further up in the range you go, the more expensive the added storage starts to become. For instance, upgrading from the base 128 gigabytes of storage to the 256, or from the 256 to the 512 gigabyte options, that's $200 per increment, so not terribly bad until now. However, when you increase that further, from 512 gigabytes to 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes, that's $300 per increment. Of course, this is probably down to the fact that the first three models, the 128, 256, and 512 gigabyte storage options get 8 gigs of RAM standard, whereas the 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte storage options get 16 gigabytes of RAM. But they could have at least went the way that they do with the MacBooks and given you the option to opt in for the 16 gigabytes of memory, because let's be very clear about one thing. iPadOS doesn't use 16 gigabytes of RAM. I have here a 2018 model with only 4 gigabytes, and I've never been concerned of it running out of memory or it being far too slow to run apps or anything like that. So the fact that they're pricing in the RAM upgrade for the storage doesn't represent such great value to me. At least that's my opinion. Now, if you think that the pricing in of the memory is mandated or not, whichever way you look at it, this thing gets eye-wateringly expensive. A fully spec'd out iPad Pro 12.9-inch with 5G, 2 terabytes of storage and 16 gigabytes of RAM is $2,400. And that's before we add the Magic Keyboard, which is point number 2. You see, Apple introduced the Magic Keyboard in 2020 as a fashionable way to turn your iPad into something resembling a MacBook or a traditional laptop. And it's fantastic, albeit a little bit pricey. So let's say you had last year's 12.9-inch model, and you would assume that because this generation is pretty much the same size, your keyboard would work with the new model, which is exactly what I assumed. And imagine my surprise when I found out that that's not actually the case. You see, Apple just released a new Magic Keyboard for this year. While this new generation of Magic Keyboard is also backwards compatible with previous gen models, critically, the iPad Pro 12.9-inch does not fit the 2020 Magic Keyboard for the 2020 12.9-inch iPad Pro. And this is because the new generation is half a millimeter thicker.
What?
Apparently, sticking that Liquid Display XDR on top of the iPad Pro 12.9-inch model adds half a millimeter to the thickness. And I understand it. This causes it not to close properly when attached to the 2020 Magic Keyboard, because the Magic Keyboard itself is built with very tiny tolerances in mind, so it can't accommodate that extra half a millimeter. Now, I understand perfectly fine why the Magic Keyboard is built with light tolerances in mind. It needs to be able to grip your iPad Pro properly so that your $1,000 plus investment doesn't spill on the ground and crack the screen, transforming it into a very expensive repair. I can understand that. What I can't understand and I cannot believe is that Apple couldn't find the technical wherewithal to remove that half a millimeter extra thickness. If I lauded them in my previous video, the impressions video that I did about the whole event for including a user replaceable battery in the AirTag, here I need to trash them, and everybody needs to. Do you actually believe that they couldn't remove that half a millimeter of extra thickness? Like give the iPad Pro slightly worse battery life than before, to like give it 10 minutes less battery life? No, they're going about the way of forcing users to spend out another $350 if they've already spent it last year. While this is also a kick in the face to most users from a financial standpoint, it goes against any kind of eco-friendliness approach you want to talk about. Because e-waste is a huge problem and we need to be aware of it. Designing accessories for your tech gadgets that you need to swap out every year is a surefire way to generate more e-waste, not reduce it in any way, shape, or form. So I'm really peeved at Apple doing this. This kind of move echoes what I hear from non-Apple fans all the time, that their products are needlessly expensive and they are created with profit in mind. And you can't really blame people for believing that. I mean, you spent a lot of money last year to get an accessory, which this year you need to replace. So not only you need to spend $2,400 on that iPad, you're going to add $350 for the keyboard. And it gets outrageous. So $2,750 for a laptop replacement. Okay? This brings us to the two other major issues that I have with the iPad Pro. You see, here I am with a 3-year-old iPad Pro, and I've never found the hardware to be the problem. I've never went about saying, oh, this is so slow, it needs updating. The iPad Pro was already a very high-powered, very highly efficient tablet, and it could do pretty much any task you threw at it. Adding more capable hardware will bring very limited returns, because guess what? This iPad generation will also need to live within the confines of iPadOS. There's many people hoping that Apple will bring macOS to the iPads, and if you're one of those people, I'm sorry, but I'm about to burst your bubble. That is not happening anytime soon. First, two major Apple executives said as much in an interview a couple of days ago. Apple Senior Vice President of Worldwide Marketing Greg Joswiak and Senior Vice President of Hardware Engineering John Ternus pretty much shot down any sort of rumors concerning macOS coming to the iPadOS. They clearly stated that Apple's very happy with the two devices living on separately and working together as need may be. They've often found that their customers prefer to purchase both a MacBook and an iPad and use each tool for a separate type of task. And you also need to bring common sense into the equation. I'm sure that this generation of iPad Pro will sell very, very well. But you remember that I said earlier that Apple has 33% of the entire tablet market for 2020? Those numbers stack up over the years in the past as well, so there's millions and tens of millions of iPads in the wild. Even if the new iPad Pro would have absolutely zero trouble in running macOS, do you think a 3-year-old base iPad would? Or how about a brand new base iPad that you can buy today on Apple's website, powered by the A12 Bionic chip with 3 gigs of RAM? If macOS would be coming to the iPads, those devices would all become obsolete in one fell swoop. So Apple basically would be throwing away their entire customer base. So it makes very little sense for them to do such a move. Thirdly, macOS doesn't have a touch interface built into it. It's not designed to work with touch interfaces yet. Maybe secretly Apple's working on this, but there's no macOS device out there that supports a touch interface. So they would have to sink enormous amounts of money in development in making sure that macOS would work very well on a touch-first device. What will most definitely happen though, and Apple hinted very heavily at this during their presentation, is select pro-level apps from macOS will be brought to iPadOS in conjunction with the developers. If you watched their entire presentation in the Spring Loaded event, you would have noted that there was an entire section of about 2 to 3 minutes of basically guest starring CEOs from other software companies as well as app developers who all praised the M1 powered iPad Pro and the amount of processing power it brings. So it's pretty clear to me that Apple has laid the foundations first before building the house. They first needed to make sure that they have the hardware that can support more advanced software, because they're all about the experience. They don't want you to experience a laggy, buggy software that can't run properly because the hardware is not in place. So if you are waiting for Final Cut Pro on the iPads, that's going to become a reality really, really soon. But there is one more caveat here. You see, performance. For video editing, the iPad Pro was a fantastic device because up until last year, for instance, there were no equivalent products in the MacBook lineup that would offer similar performance, similar experience, and for similar pricing. It made very little sense at all to buy a MacBook Air with an Intel chip inside, since the performance would probably be a bit worse. You would end up having significantly shorter battery life, while having a loud and hot device to contend with, as Intel chips tended to get really hot under load, thus causing the fans built into the Macs to work overtime to dissipate all of that heat. Well, that problem no longer exists because the MacBook Air now also sports the same M1 chip, and it's also a fanless design. So the performance of the new iPad Pro will be in line with that of the MacBook Air. However, critically, this will leave it a few percentage points behind M1 powered devices that have active cooling, such as the newly released iMac and the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch, as well as the Mac Mini. All of those devices have active cooling inside, which means they will be able to sustain heavier workloads for longer without thermal throttling. So, if outright performance out of the M1 is your thing, the iPad Pro may not actually be the best device for the purpose. So now, on to the final conclusions. So as I've said before, I'm not even considering the 11-inch iPad Pro here because it misses out on the Liquid Retina XDR display, and while I personally won't consider it, perhaps it's going to be a good deal for your particular workflow considering the fact that it still retains last year's similar pricing. Now as for the 12.9-inch model, well, there are two categories. So, first category of potential buyers. If you have all the money in the world and can afford to spend whatever you want on your tech gadgets, sure thing, go ahead, get whatever model you want in whatever configuration you want. I'm certain it's going to be a fantastic device and a fantastic tablet, bar none. Okay, so it's going to be great in all aspects. However, even in that case, don't get your hopes up of getting one very soon because pre-ordering will just start on the 30th of April with deliveries slated for the second half of May. So you're looking at about another month or so until you can get one. Now, as for the rest of us who actually need to contend with a budget when doing tech purchases, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. If you go with the base model, skip 5G entirely and don't go crazy with the storage options, it will be a good device to purchase. It's not going to be too pricey and it's not going to be terrible value for money. For the more expensive models though, I'm not entirely sure. Just consider this. A fully spec'd out iPad Pro 2021 12.9-inch with 2TB of storage, 16GB of RAM, 5G connectivity, and a Magic Keyboard on top, that's $2,750. If you were to add like any cheap mouse, but critically without the Apple Pencil, you'd be looking at $2,800, which is a lot of money. It is extremely expensive. And for me, even if I've had all of that money, it would still be a particularly tough sell. For that kind of expenditure, you can actually get the entire working Apple ecosystem. And it goes something like this. You could buy a base MacBook Air that's $1,000. To that you can add a base iPad for $330, a 128GB iPhone SE for $450, an Apple Watch SE for $279, base AirPods for $159, and the total would still end up being cheaper than the iPad itself at $2,218. You can even splurge on some other items. So let's say you remove the base iPad and replace it with the iPad Air, which is $600, and you can also splurge a little bit more to get an iPhone 11, or even step up a little bit more to get an iPhone 12 mini. And as for the storage, well, you can buy an external SSD that will work just fine with the MacBook Air. I've actually done a recent video here on the channel about this. The value proposition for the top-end models, at least to me, looks to be absolutely terrible. It's a great device, but I would never spend anywhere near that kind of money, even if I had the budget for this kind of purchase. And even if you were a pro, so let's say you're someone who's waiting for this model to really start using it for video editing and photography editing because it has a gorgeous screen and so on, I would still urge you to wait. WWDC will start on the 7th of June. Then we should start finding out what new apps will come to the iPads in iPadOS 15. And you won't even have to wait that long. Remember that I said earliest deliveries you can get are probably in the second half of May. WWDC starts on the 7th of June, so there's not a lot of waiting involved. With that being said, thank you very much for watching. If you find the content enjoyable, informative, or useful in any way, please like the video, subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my videos, and help me in growing out the channel. This would mean a great deal to me. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.